Welcome. One of the things that we're going to do is talk a little bit about Chapter 1, the rest of Chapter 1. Remember I said if you'd kind of follow along in the code book, you would have an understanding of what needs to be done. Hopefully you've read this chapter once, you've looked at Chapter 1, Part 1, and now we're going to get into Part 2. Okay. One of the things I like for you to do is go to page 17 to 20 in your textbook, because what we're going to end up doing is kind of talking a little bit about codes and standards and changes that might be taking place. So you can see those if you review through pages 17 through 20. But I'm kind of wanting you to look at page 20. This talks a little bit about what you see in each chapter and the differences between the IBC and the NFPA and the life safety codes. So they're laid out, the books are laid out a little bit different, and you need to be able to do that. Also, you need to reference the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Park Services. They currently use I codes. So it's a little bit different there. But kind of know the difference between the IBC, NFPA, and the LSC. All right, we talked about building codes and how they stress the construction requirements of an entire building and place restrictions on hazardous materials or equipment used within a building. Of course, the reason is to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of the people using the building. From the building code, you may need to reference other codes and standards, because in through here, the IBC code book, which we're going to be using, it is going to reference the plumbing code. It's going to reference the plumbing code. It's going to reference, of course, the fuel code. And so a building official may end up having to go. But we're going to kind of learn a little bit just about the content of the IBC code book. Chapters common to buildings interiors, and if you were to look at the IBC book, you're going to see code book, you're going to see that these are different chapters that we'll kind of be highlighting within this semester. Use or occupancy classifications, types of construction, fire-resistant materials and construction, interior finishes, fire protection systems, means of egress, accessibility, interior environment, and of course plumbing systems. One of the things, as I've referenced before, the life safety code, that kind of is referenced in the IBC code book. Even though I do not require you to purchase that, I will give you a lot of content, and you will see in the textbook how they reference that. Just like the IBC code book, the NFPA 101 is revised every 3 years. Now, the life safety code is not a building code, but it's a life safety code that concentrates on problems involving the removal of all persons from a building fire zone. So, they concentrate mainly on occupancy, means of egress, and fire protection. So you'll just kind of have to have an understanding, and we'll be bringing all this out throughout our semester. Now, some jurisdictions require the life safety code in addition to, so you'll just have to research your jurisdiction. Remember, I asked you, what is a jurisdiction? That is whatever your city or area that you're in, and it may be what that city or city commissioners have adopted. And it could be the 2012, it could be 3 years earlier, right, 2009, or they may already be on the 2015 IBC code book. Now, when we talk about performance codes, I want you to really look at page 21 and then turn the page. It talks about performance codes on page 21. But look at page 22, because one of the things that you're going to end up having to know is what is the difference between a performance code and a prescriptive code. Okay? And this gives a good example between the differences, because a prescriptive code specifies exactly what has to be done. So the example in the textbook talks about rail elements, and it says, shall not have openings which allow passage of sphere 4 inches in diameter from the walking surface to the required guardrail or guard height. So it's telling you exactly how you have to measure each direction. Well, if you look at performance codes, they don't mandate the spacing. Instead, it kind of specifies that the opening shall be an appropriate size and configuration to keep people from falling through based on the anticipated age of the occupants. So that means you would have to go back and find out, are children going to be in this building at all? And if so, then what are the measurements that you would have to have on that railing? So make sure you have an understanding and know the difference between a performance and a prescriptive. Okay, we've talked about the IBC. Remember, there are different fire codes, life safety codes, plumbing codes, mechanical codes, electrical codes, energy codes, and sustainability codes. So there's little overviews of these within that first chapter. We're going to spend a little time on accessibility, but I want you to have just a quick overview, since it's in this chapter, of the 4 main accessibility documents. That's the ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute. There's the ADAG, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines. There's the UFAS, Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. And there's the FHAG, which stands for the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. And then in the state of Texas, we always learn about TAS, or TAS, some people call it, but TAS is what I reference it, is the Texas Accessibility Standards. Kind of make sure you read over and have an understanding of those. Now, we talked about the Americans with Disability Act. It is kind of a 4-part federal law, and it was mandated starting July 26 in 1990, and it started being enforceable in 1992. And it's a comprehensive city rights law, and it protects individuals with disabilities in the area of employment, which is referenced Title I, state and local government services and public transportation's Title II. So you see buses that come around have to have, of course, all different types of public transportation, and has to be accessible. And then Title III deals with public accommodations and commercial facilities. So we want those facilities to be universal. Universal design means, of course, it needs to make sure that anyone has access to that building. And then Title IV talks about telecommunication services, so that if you're in a hotel, you still have the capabilities of listening to the phone, or you may end up being able to get out of the particular building. Now, in addition to, as a designer or a contractor, you need to know a little bit about the different federal departments that are out there. There are some that you need to be aware of, and that is the ATCBC, which is the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board. There is HUD, which I'm sure you've heard of, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So in case some of you decide to design different spec homes that wants to be approved by HUD, there's a whole different slew of codes that you have to follow. And there's the Department of Justice, which is referenced as the DOJ. Okay, federal regulations. Federal government plays a part in the building process. It regulates its own facilities. So like VA hospitals, courtrooms, all those are federal governments, and they have their own set of rules that has to be there. It can pass federal legislation creating a law that supersedes all other state and local codes and standards, example like the ADA. The Americans with Disability Act is a federal, and some states have adopted their own accessibility requirements, like California and Texas. We talked about in Texas, we have the TOS, Texas Accessibility Standards. You have the Fair Housing Act, which is HUD, which is federal legislation and enforced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And then you have Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is OSHA, sets standards on as a needed basis, regulates the designs of buildings and interior projects where people are employed. So what is a standard? You know, a standard is a definition, and if you look on page 33, it talks a little bit about standards throughout the book. And in through here, you're going to learn that, well, I guess more on page 43. Go to 43. A standard is a definition, a recommended practice, a test method, a classification, or a required specification that must be met. Standards are developed by, of course, trade associations, government agencies, and standards writing organizations. And members of these groups are often allowed to vote on particular issues. Now, by themselves, standards have no legal standing and said that are typically referenced by the codes. But the standards become law when the code is adopted by its jurisdiction. In some cases, a jurisdiction will adopt an individual standard that then supplements the code. For example, some jurisdictions are adopting sustainability standards. So, looking at some of these, as I said, standards become law when a code is adopted by its jurisdiction. Another example, of course, instead of setting a particular fire extinguisher requirement, the ICC references the NFPA 10, portable fire extinguishers. And then the NFPA 10 becomes a part of the enforced building code. So, standard organizations, which I mentioned, would be the NFPA. Many of the NFPA standards are geared toward fire protection. Their testing methods cover everything from textiles to firefighting equipment and means of egress design. And then we have the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and they are coordinator of voluntary standards. They approve the standards development by other organizations and only develops a standard when commissioned by an industry group or government agencies. Most common ANSI standards used by interior designers is the ANSI A117.1. It's the standard on accessibility and usable building and facilities, or the ICC ANSI standard concentrates, of course, on accessibility. I know all this is very confusing and there's so much to kind of grasp, but we're going to slowly go through and it'll start gelling together. Also, other standards organizations, the American Society for Testing Materials, which is the ASTM International, standards writing organization. They have 2 of the 15 categories that deal with construction and textiles. And then ASHRA, you hear a lot about, is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. They deal with HVAC and refrigeration. They have uniform testing methods, design requirements, and recommended standard practices, of course, on all types of heating, HVAC units. And then probably the one you're most familiar with is the Underwriters Laboratory. It's a testing agency, tests various devices and systems and materials to see if it meets particular requirements related to life, fire, casualty, hazards, and crime prevention. The UL, of course, you see on a lot of light fixtures. If you look down, you might look at a lamp in your apartment or dorm, and you see the UL. So it has been tested and passed that, knowing that those components that you use will work. Energy Policy Act, which is the EPA, was enacted by federal government in 1992. That's where we're starting to promote energy efficiency and conservation. It amended Title III of the Energy Conservation and Production Act, and it mandated the use of the 1989 edition of the Sustainability Standards, ASHRAE IESNA 901. I know that sounds confusing, but what it is, it's just been updated in 2005, and beginning in 2011, some of those others were updated. You can go to their website. It's just mandating all types of businesses and stuff to know that you've got to follow a lot of these new energy policies. Every jurisdiction, which we talked about, cities or areas or states, have local municipality ordinances. They may have health codes. You hear health reports going on for food prep and sanitation to hospital size, location. Sometimes there's zoning regulations from residential, business. Sometimes you'll have historic preservation ordinances. You may have signage or landscaping ordinances, and you may have neighborhood restrictions. We talked about the UL labels, most widely recognized. They test, remember, all products, and you can look at your markings. I just want to kind of make sure you understand, from light fixtures, products that have been tested. It's really recognizable. So your assignment is to go to a city of choice to see what additional ordinances they have and what their zoning regulations are. And zoning is a little bit different, and we get into that into 314, one of your particular studio courses. But, you know, what it does, it protects you from building a strip zone right next to a church, next to someone's home. So there's all different types of restrictions when it comes to zoning. But there are other type of ordinances that you might have. Remember, I said historical. There may be a historical overlay. There may be health codes. There may be landscaping. You're required to have so many trees, or you've got to be able to have a certain size of signage. So what I want you to do is just kind of review, pick a city, and then write me a summary and give me the links in place. Put your name on the top right-hand corner. Make sure you cite all websites and place in assignment 1. So, I hope that you have kind of, this has given you a clear understanding, a little bit of part of Chapter 1.